y'all. Welcome. Today we are going to take a magnifying glass look at one of the events that occurred when Jesus was on earth ministering. Jesus performed many miracles and many signs while he was on earth, including healing. Word spread, and wherever he went, crowds would gather in hopes of being healed from various ailments. It would be similar today if a doctor held the cure for cancer and he was the only one that had the cure for cancer. People would flock to him, crowds would gather, people would come from all over the world. But this is actually even greater than that, because Jesus is the cure for our sin issue. He is the cure for our eternity, for our salvation, for getting rid of sin and being restored and put into relationship with him. And it is an eternal cure. Jesus is the only one who holds the cure for our sin issue for eternity. And if we entrust our lives to him and submit and humble our lives to him, we receive his cure. We'll go ahead and start in chapter 5, verse 21. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her. Heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had actually gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I will be healed." Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. So we're going to pause really quick there. An important ruler of the synagogue shows up by name Jairus, and his name actually means God enlightens. He would have been looked up to by the Pharisees and the scribes, who were actually opposed to Jesus. And here he is, falling on his knees in the face of Jesus. He physically demonstrates what he holds in his heart: desperate faith in Jesus and who Jesus is. He doesn't care that his fellow Pharisees are shocked by his actions and staring at him in disbelief. And they're like silent, watching to see what his next move might be. He is only focused on Jesus, and he pleads with him because his only daughter is very, very sick and she is dying. She was only 12 years old. All of his hope is in Jesus for healing of his daughter. Imagine if your sister or your brother or a parent or a close family member, if they were in the ICU, barely clinging to life. Jesus is his only hope, and he pleads with Jesus, "Please save my daughter." He verbalizes his confident faith in Jesus, knowing if Jesus would lay his hands on her, she would live. And Jesus agrees, and Jesus goes with him, and so does the crowd. And I'm certain that Jairus was probably trying to urge him along, urgently trying to rush Jesus along to his house, since his daughter was in severe critical condition. Her situation was vital. But there's this huge crowd in the way, and he can't break through, and everything is taking longer than he wants. And then this woman in the crowd shows up, and she had been sick for 12 years, the same number of years that this little girl had been alive. And she is not even supposed to be in that crowd of people, because it was against the law. It was against the law of Moses. Sick people were supposed to stay outside the city, away from the people, so that no one else would be infected. She likely hadn't been touched or hugged for 12 years. Just think about that. She had exhausted every single option, and her last and only hope was in Jesus. She physically demonstrates what she holds in her heart: desperate faith in Jesus and who he is. She is so desperate that she breaks the law. She breaks the law to be there. She reaches out to Jesus' robe for healing. Her thoughts demonstrate confident faith in Jesus and knowing that if she even would just touch his robe, she would be healed. And let's pick up from there and see what happens next. Immediately, the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once the healing power had gone from him, so he turned in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me?" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There is no use troubling the teacher now." So we're going to again pause right there. So Jesus stops for this woman. He's moving in the crowd, trying to get to Jairus' house to save that little 12-year-old girl. And this woman who has had this bleeding issue for 12 years, she reaches out and touches his robe faithfully, knowing if she could just touch his robe, she'd be healed. And she was healed. It worked. And Jesus stops. Jesus stops for her. Jairus had to have been losing his mind at this point. He's more likely losing it, thinking, "Oh my goodness, Jesus, why are you stopping? Why are you stopping? My daughter is dying. We got to keep going. Why are you stopping?" But that's the thing. Jesus stops for you. Jesus always stops for you. He is never too busy for you. He loves you, and he wants you to bring every last need, everything in your heart, every emotion. He wants you to bring it all to him in desperate, confident faith. Saving faith is desperate. Saving faith is confident in knowing Jesus and knowing who he is and what he does. Jesus knows this woman's need and he knows her condition, but he makes it personal. He stops and he says, "Who touched my robe?" He felt that healing power that moved through him in response to her desperate, confident faith. There is like a ton of people around him, and Jesus knows, but he still asks. He still asks her. He wants to hear from us. He wants to hear from this woman. He wants to hear from every single one of us all day, every day. His disciples are like, "Do you see this crowd here? Like, seriously, you're asking, like, who touched me? Anyone and everyone has probably touched you. What kind of crazy question is that?" And Jairus, he must have been like sweating bullets at this point, because now he's stopping and asking, like, who touched him in this big giant crowd. He was probably thinking something like, "Really? Now we're stopping because somebody accidentally touched you?" But meanwhile, there's always a meanwhile with Jesus. Jesus remained stopped for this woman who touched him. She is trembling in fear at this point. Not only was she supposed to not be in the city around any of these people, she certainly was not supposed to be touching anyone. But Jesus looks at her compassionately and he calls her daughter. It's personal. She wasn't just healed from an illness that day, she was healed for eternity. Desperate, confident faith conquers suffering. Faith does not have to be perfect, just desperate and confident in who Jesus is. Jesus stopped to give her an opportunity to turn her desperation into passionate love for him. He stopped to make sure she knew it was her faith that healed her, not the robe. He stopped so she could step forward and up into the presence of God. This was a powerful and life-changing moment for the woman, but also a painful, heartbreaking moment for Jairus. The same moment that this woman receives new life and restoration and redemption and healing, he hears the news that his precious one and only daughter has now died. He had to have been overtaken with grief in that instant as he looks over at Jesus and this woman and sees them talking and his daughter has just died. He is certain now that there's nothing that can be done. It's too late. But wait, Jesus is still present. Jesus is always present. We're going to go ahead and continue in verse 36. But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just have faith." Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, "Talitha Kaum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. So Jesus responds and tells him to hang on. Cling to Jesus. He has all authority. He has all power over death. And he is about to show Jairus the truth of this as God enlightens him. Jesus is the only one who can conquer death because Jesus is life, and death cannot hold life down. The original Greek word here for overheard, Jesus overheard, is actually parakousis, and it truly means he ignored or refused to listen or acknowledge to what was being said. He tells Jairus, "No worries. Look, don't be afraid. Don't listen to these fools. Believe me. Cling to me in that desperate, confident faith." Jairus had 2 options here. He is faced with 2 options. He could choose to believe Jesus and trust in him, or he could choose fear, which is to trust this world and what the world around him is telling him. Trusting the world leads to fear, but trusting in Jesus leads to faith. Jesus was a known healer of diseases, but from the world's view, it was too late for that. The girl had already died. At this point, Jesus had not yet risen anyone from the dead. Jesus is asking Jairus to trust him here against all odds. Jesus took him by the arm and walked him home and told the world around him to get lost. They are not allowed in. Other than his faithful disciples and the family of this girl, no one was allowed in. They enter that home and they see that this home is filled with wailing and crying, family and friends mourning deeply for the loss of this daughter. Jesus asks, "Why are they all weeping and crying?" Jairus believed Jesus would heal his daughter, and he's probably taken back by that question because his daughter is lying there dead. Jesus very confidently tells him she is just sleeping, and the crowd laughs and mocks Jesus, and Jesus made those laughing fools get out. Anyone who laughs at your faith in Jesus needs to be kicked out of your inner circle of life. The words of Jesus have power, and Jairus is about to see that power. He walks in with Jesus, seeing his sweet daughter lying there. He likely told her that he was going to be leaving to go get someone who could help her, who could save her, who could heal her. And now she's lying there dead, and he didn't even get to say goodbye. Now, touching a dead body is something that would make a person unclean according to their law. But Jesus is not concerned with that. Jesus is the one who makes the unclean clean. He takes her by the hand and he speaks. "Little girl," he says. The original Hebrew word for little girl is actually considered a term of endearment. It's similar to like saying, "Hey, sweetie," or "Hey, hon." It's an endearing term. And again, he makes it personal. He takes her hand and he calls her little girl, "Sweetie." And she rises, and everyone but Jesus is completely shocked. And her father and mother had to have hugged her so hard. She was dead, and Jesus gave her life. Wait until those mockers see this. Jesus directs them to feed her and care for her. She's just been very sick and was likely in need of much physical nourishment. He cares about every single one of our needs. He loves us completely. And in response to the words of Jesus, she rises to life. Jesus has all authority, and his words are power. Jesus even has full authority over death. So there's nothing that we can't trust him with and through. Death is real, and death does happen to all of us at some point unless Jesus returns first. But death is not the end. Death does not have the final word. Jesus does. Sin causes us to turn from God to ourselves, but Jesus offers us his life for eternity if we're willing to turn from ourselves to him. If we will put our desperate, confident faith in him and believe, trust him with your life for eternity instead of the world around us, Jesus stops for you. It's up to each and every one of us to respond to him in desperate, confident faith and actively live and believe that we truly are his. He truly is our eternal Savior, and we can walk confidently in that desperate faith in him today and forever. Thanks, y'all. I hope you're having a glorious day in the Lord.